What is up? My name is Tim Benniks and I am very excited to speak at this conference. Thank you for that lovely intro. And so before we dive into what cable management for the Jamstack actually is, let's talk a bit about me and where I work, because actually this is a sponsored spot. So I get to speak about where I work and why you should probably have a look at it as a developer. So first things first, I am Tim Benniks. You can find me here or maybe here. I don't know how I edit this yet, on Twitter. My accent is probably quite strange. That's because I'm Dutch, but I live in France and I work in English. So that's where what that is coming from. And so, like I said, this is a sponsored spot. I work at Uniform, where I am the principal developer advocate. And at Uniform, we work in that space of making things composable and cable managing everything behind your digital experience platform before it becomes a website. And in this case, the Jamstack. And so I'll weave in Uniform at one point into the talk so you can see where that fits. So let's get down to it. When you build the Jamstack websites nowadays, there's a lot of things going on before it's actually built. Right? All these connections and different things and different sources. And so I want to talk about how you can cable manage that in a nice way so it looks neat and it's maintainable. And also, if you do it well, you never have to do like a big re-platform when your next design comes along or when you want to do a mobile app or something else. And so I want to start this talk by talking about sandwiches. I know that's quite strange, right? But it actually kind of makes sense. I just kind of want to explain some things according to the sandwich analogy. And then once those basics are in, we're going to go into the code and I'm going to give you some examples. So first things first, what we used to work with, and they're still around, are monolithic suites. And a monolithic suite is basically a suite of software that has everything inside of this one bucket, from web servers to front end to back end to database to user management to everything. And we can actually think about these as a prepackaged sandwich, because a prepackaged sandwich that you buy at, let's say, a bakery kind of fits 80-90% of the people, because, well, why would a baker make something that doesn't fit for everybody, right? But it's not fully like what you would want always, but it's good enough. And that's why I want to talk about the sandwiches, because when you look at the modern times where we are now with the tools that you probably are using, it's much more of a composed architecture where you don't have one suite with everything in it, but you probably have CMS comes from here, my hosting comes from there, my CDN comes from there, my front-end framework is this one. You choose. And so basically you're making composed architectures, and composed architectures are more like sandwiches that you make yourself. You choose how much cheese you want. And you choose different things that probably fit well together and other things that you don't need. You just don't put it on your sandwich. And so basically what we used to have is these suites, right? So if you see here on the screen, we have like front-end hosting, API, CMS, commerce, everything is bundled together into one big box. And then over time, and this is a couple of years ago, where we saw like, oh yeah, but we need freedom as front-end developers, right? We want to code our own stuff with our own standards. Let's get away from this big suite that it's there. And so you saw that like things like CDN hosting or front-end frameworks or APIs were extracted from it. Now, getting closer to where we are now, you can see that only the CMS remains, right? And the CMS is now actually also kind of a standalone thing. So that suite no longer really exists. And so where is Jamstack in this story? Well, Jamstack is actually playing a vital role if you actually work with a system that is no longer one suite, but has all these separate blocks. And so there is no more origin server. And what I mean by origin is like there's not one place where at runtime you connect to that knows everything, right? That is this big suite or this one monolithical system. It doesn't really exist anymore. And so all the magic is starting to happen on the CDN closer to the user. And with that in mind, that Jamstack works really, really well on the CDN because it's just a bunch of static files with a little bit of dynamicism in AJAX calls and maybe edge handlers. And so Jamstack really works well for a system that has no origin. Everything is separated, everything is decentralized. And so it becomes API first. If you go to have a look at any sort of headless CMS or headless commerce, it's all API first. That's their output, right? And with this, because everything is API first, there's not really a blueprint for what is the best way to build your website. So you kind of have to be smarter as a technical stakeholder to choose which things go together well, but there's not one way to do it the right way, right? And because of this, new product categories are starting to emerge. And Uniform is one of them. Uniform offers you painkillers to deal with this, all these different systems, and how do we orchestrate them? How do you scale one part, and how do you change other things and make it easy for developers, but also content editors, because you might not want to log in into 15 systems to make one page, right? And so these new product categories emerge because even if we have these super fancy new destructured, right, decentralized systems, you still have issues because architectures can really bog down your digital pipeline. And a digital pipeline is not only just owned by the developers, it's also owned by content editors, marketers, researchers, data analysts, right? It's kind of a bigger picture. And so the problem we see all the time, and I used to work at agencies my whole career, and I've always had these issues where you build a new thing, developers are happy, everybody's cool, the client is happy, and then a month in, the marketing department of your client wants to make a new campaign. And then you build this like super fancy Jamstack front end with all these headless sources, right? And they all come together in the Jamstack. Then this marketer tells you or calls you up, yeah, can you just make me a new page in that Jamstack site that then connects all the things from two different instances for our headless CMS, like some global data and some local data. I want some business things, like I want maybe some personalization, but I also want products to sell. And suddenly you're telling this developer, yeah, give me those 5 connections, put them on. And then the developer is like, nope, I don't have that time. I'm mid-sprint. What are you asking me? It's not going to happen. And so that's a feeling we always had. And then the developer is unhappy because they didn't build something that's flexible enough, right? Even though they did a great job at the code, it's not really usable. And the marketer or the content editor is kind of upset because they want to do their job, which is tell a story, to sell something, or to be awesome about whatever thing they want to be doing. And so there's a little bit of frustration. And this is also why marketers and developers don't really go well together, because they both have their needs and wants, and it doesn't really fit. And so Uniform is there to help you solve that problem, right? And so what we see is there's a couple of problems, and let's highlight them here. And then I'll show you a bit of Uniform and a bit of code to actually figure out what these differences are and how we can solve them. And so composing pages with different headless sources is generally complex for both developers and content editors. That goes to that example that I just gave, right? How do you compose with all these different sources and then have freedom and flexibility and the power of choice of how you do that? And then on top of that, if you have this big system, how do you make it like that it has a great developer experience, great maintainability, and how do you future-proof it so you don't have to re-platform or recode everything when a new thing appears, like when you switch your commerce provider, or when you switch your CMS. You don't want to be recoding the whole thing, right? And so these are two big problems that we see as developers. What tends to happen is, if you look at this really fun image here of Homer, where basically websites could look amazing on the front, right? They might even perform pretty well, but on the back side of it, if you don't have a good tool to cable manage, you kind of just tie your back fat and neck fat together, and it's kind of a little dirty in the backside, but it looks really good on the front end. But this is not really maintainable, and developers in it are not super happy, but content editors the same. And you kind of end up with this if you have all these different sources. So we need to cable manage. But so what we want to do is we want to go from this, because over time it will just look like this. There's just so much new features and things like that. We want to go to this. This is what we like, right? And so in the past, I worked on this website, and these people had a big budget. We were allowed to build a new team to completely rebuild their front end of their e-commerce from scratch. We had an older backend system, but the front end was completely clean. And this project looked like this. Oh boy, it was cool. The thing is, we were able to say, look, Ma, we cable managed, but like at what cost? Because I actually hired a full team for this, and it took us 6 months to have the first component on the page. That's how much DX we had to do, how much architecture and thinking. And so it was an extremely expensive process for a website that is now super cool. Let's be honest, it's great to have worked on this. But we need to kind of normalize how to do this for everybody. Like if you in the audience want to start this tomorrow, you should have a way to cable manage things super nice so they're super maintainable and they work really well. And it's easy also for content editors. So let's reiterate a little bit, because in these architectures now, everything is API first. There's no more origin. There's no architecture blueprint. And we have these new categories, right? And so an ideal scenario would be that there's a platform that has no center of the universe, right? It just helps putting things together. Like you can see here on the screen, there's multiple different things going on and they all live alongside each other. It's no longer stacked on top of each other like in the older systems. And so what we need is a platform that is completely opinionless, right? Because there's the one thing we can do is tell everybody in this audience, you can only use Angular or only use jQuery to use our tools. Nobody would use it. Or you would, some of you would probably use it, but the others would be just upset with me, right? So you don't want a vendor lock-in. You don't want roadmap constraints. You want total freedom and you want an SDK that's awesome. And so this sounds a little magical, right? But what you want to be doing actually is look at it like this, right? You have some CMS, you have some commerce. You want to compose pages with the different things from these sources. Then you want to actually put that in the framework of your choice. Would that be Svelte Kit or Next or Nuxt or anything goes, right? Remix Run, whatever. And then you want to have instant preview of your live website or your live website when you're putting these sources in. And then you hit run and it goes to your CDN and everybody's happy. And it can be different things, right? You should be able to switch it up and do whatever you want. And so that sounds really fancy and magical, just like this image. And so let's have a look at how you can compose with different headless sources using Uniform, right? And also how that will keep developers and content editors happy working together. And then also let's have a look at that replatforming. So this kind of goes back to these problems I described earlier. And so how I want to show you this is by showing you my personal site. I always rebuild my site just to try new tech, right? And in this case, I joined Uniform, looked at the tech. So, okay, I'm going to have to try this. How else can I do this conference talk, right? And so let's dive in with the first problem is, okay, how can we work with these multiple sources and put it together? I'll show you in the interface, then I'll show you some code, and then we show like how this preview works and how that looks. All right, we are in the browser. And today I want to show you my own website and how I built it and what kind of different sources it uses to then cable manage these and then go into the Jamstack. And let's focus on the homepage for a second. And so what you can see here, I of course have a header and a footer below, and there's a hero here, and I have some highlighted videos of the videos I've made that I chose to highlight. Then I have an image and some rich text about the work I do, and then I have my latest talks and latest blog posts. And you can see the Jam Dev is here. It's actually today for you, but when I recorded this, it was still up and coming. Anyways, so this is the page and it has been composed with different sources from Uniform. So my website is using Contentful, BigCommerce, Google Analytics, Uniform Canvas itself, and Prismic. I'm using Prismic for my blog post because I really like their rich text editor and what comes out of it, how to deal with that. Contentful does similar things. And so I use Contentful for my videos, my talks, and some components here and there. And then I also have some fake products to show you some stuff, and that comes from BigCommerce. And I'm actually using the analytics integration to make sure that once I do personalization across all these sources, or I do an A/B test that I know which one is used more than the other. Anyways, so let's look up to that canvas thing that I'm talking about. So Uniform Canvas is basically offering you a canvas in which you can make compositions with different sources, and then you can basically drag and drop your page together. And so this is no code yet. We're going to get there, I promise. So let's have a look at that homepage, right? And so what we just looked at is basically that hero, these video highlights, my rich text stuff, and my latest talks and latest blog posts. And that is basically what you see here. And so a composition in Uniform doesn't have to be a page. It can also be a chunk on our website somewhere with a bunch of components. In my case, I made it a page. So I gave it a slug of / home. And I actually made a composition that is, or like a component that is a composition component. And in this case, I called that the page, and it has a slot called components where we inject all our components. And everything that you put in here, all these components, they have specific types of parameters. You can choose them. And so my hero, for example, has multiple parameters. One is for a variant, because I also want a hero without an image sometimes. And that variant sits in Uniform. You can choose that property there. But the entry of the content is actually coming from Contentful. So Uniform doesn't own that at all. It just points to it. So if I want to edit this hero, I actually go to Contentful like this. So it loads in the interface, and then you can actually edit here, because Uniform is not a CMS. Right? It's not a commerce engine. It's none of that. It's actually, it just points to sources for you so you can compose with them in an easy way. So content editing should be in the CMS, right? And so what is cool about how Uniform does this is that your content entry lives inside a CMS somewhere or in an e-commerce system. But how in context that looks to your front end, that sits in Uniform. Like for example, when you click on these video highlights here, I've added a property called background color dark or light, or a little title here, but nothing more. Normally, if you didn't have this system, the fact that the background color is dark, you would put that in your CMS. But that actually makes little sense, because I only want video highlights to be dark at this component in this page, not somewhere else. And so you want to separate concerns a little bit where you have layouting data that fits in your composition, right? That goes into Uniform. And then the real clean data for the future that you might want to use in come from your CMS or your e-commerce. So if you can look at this, you'll basically see that everything is actually a Contentful entry, because I built the basics of the content from there. But you could argue like, dude, you're just selling us this super fancy system that looks like basically a wrap around the Contentful API. Well, right now that's what it looks like, but it's actually a bit more, because what happens if I now wanted to add these products, right? So let's add some products. Where is it? There it is. And so this product thing, let's say light background, and let's call it products. Now you can see that it looks for a big commerce item rather than a Contentful item. That's how I configured it. We'll have a look at that in a sec when we show a bit more code as well. And so let's just find some Tim Benniks products. And I'm not actually selling these. These are fake, but I just want to be able to show you this stuff, right? So let's do Core Web Vitals Consulting, maybe some Nuxt, because I enjoy using Vue and Nuxt, and maybe tips and tricks on recording yourself. Let's accept and let's save and publish. So now we've actually used in the same interface a Contentful system and products from BigCommerce. So let's have a preview and let's have a look what just happened to the website. So it's going to localhost and beam. Here are my products. And so it was actually really easy to just grab something from a different source without actually knowing how that source works at all, and just showing you this. This is a lovely demo. It's all good, but you haven't seen any code, right? So let's get into that and see how that actually works, because there's a couple of things that are also amazing for developers and not just for content editors like this, right? So how about we just remove all this stuff and we just keep the hero. And I know there's a little bug in here. You've seen it, right? That's because I'm on the Canary branch. It's in the backlog. So basically, let's also remove this, save. And so we just keep the hero component. And before we have a look at how that works, let's actually have a look at how we define these components. Like here's my hero component. And so what I've done here, you see here, there's that variant thing, and there's a default variant and a no image variant. And I've also added a parameter, and that parameter is actually a contentful entry. And you are able to actually select Contentful here because that's one of the integrations. And so actually, there it is. So I selected my default environment for Contentful, and it found all the types that I have, and that's actually the hero type. And so now the system knows, okay, it needs to be something for Contentful. And so now let's have a look at, if we go back to that page and see if we now save, how that looks. So I'm going to be able to click View Source here. Let's zoom that in a little. And so basically you have a page. There's a slot for components in that page. And inside we have a hero that is then connected to an entry ID in Contentful, right? Which is actually this entry. You see, that's that same ID there. And so what is super important about this is the fact that Uniform, we don't store all that information, right? Uniform only knows I'm pointing to this thing. That's it. Because if you have some sensitive information in there, you don't want that in different systems. Or if you change maybe the publishing state of a component on your end in the CMS, or you change something, that would mean that Uniform has to then purge its cache and do stuff. It's just very complicated, and it introduces opinion in how it should work. So what we do is we just store that ID, and that's it. Now, when we have a look at the website, I have my SEO tags. Header and footer are static in my site, so they just come with the front end. There's only my hero. And so now that we've seen that it's literally only that ID, how do we then actually get that real information in there? And so how we do that in Uniform, we call this enhancers. And so let's have a look at my code, how I did this. And so I've built my website in Nuxt because I'm a Vue person. I enjoy working with Vue and Nuxt a lot. And so in my async data function, which is kind of like the get static props variant of Next, what I have done is I've created a use composition composable. And composables are kind of new things in Vue, or well, not that new, but to be able to kind of compose your page with. And my composable actually is called use composition. It has a couple of properties to it. So I'm asking the slug, my draft state, or is it my published state? In this case, it's draft, and some context for Nuxt. So if we have a look at that use composition function, in my case, I have decided to put all the knowledge of how to grab the information from the CMSs on a different project. And in this case, that's a URL here that points to a for sale project with serverless functions, where I have a composition API where I give the slug and all the stuff, all the fancy stuff on how to actually go from a uniform composition to actual data happens there. And I'm going to show you in a sec. And it basically just returns the composition. And the composition is actually a whole bunch of data with everything in it. And so the magic happens in this API here, right? So let's have a look at that API. And so I've built that here. And so before we go into what that code is, let's have a look at what comes out of it. So I'm actually asking for slug /, right? And so if you compare it to the previous one, where type contentful entry only had an ID before, now it says title, subtitle, image, description, and a whole bunch of other things. And so this one, the one that I'm querying with my code, is actually rich. And then this one doesn't have all that richness. It only has the pointer. So there's some magic in between here. And that magic we call enhancers. So when you have a look at that API /composition, what I'm doing is, let me zoom in a little bit more. We're actually using the Uniform Canvas NPM package. And what this NPM package offers you is a Canvas client. And I'm using a whole bunch of stuff from my environments variables. So I basically set up a new constructor of the Uniform Canvas client. And then here's a whole bunch of stuff to figure out what kind of query parameters I've given, because I might want to fetch only the draft state, or I want to fetch the published state and things like that. And so what we do is my Canvas client, the one we just made here, Uniform Canvas, can do get composition by slug. And that slug we just gave is actually here in the URL. It's just slash. And so for the slash composition, give me all the information. And so what this thing does on its own is actually giving you this one, right? It gives you this data with this entry ID. And so what then happens is we actually have a function called enhance, and you give it the composition and you give it the enhancers. And so this composition, or whatever came back from here, will now be enhanced or enriched with all the data that you need. And then it's returned. So it's relatively simple, but the magic happens in the enhance function. So when we have a look at these enhancers, let's have a look first at the index. And so we have an enhancer builder and a compose function, and there's a whole bunch of parameter types. Like let's have a look at that one for Contentful, right? So the Canvas Contentful parameter types, if they have anything to do with Contentful, then I will compose based on whatever parameter I have for Contentful. I use the Contentful enhancer and I do multiple things with that. And the interesting thing is that this Contentful enhancer, when we go here, can we? Yes. This thing basically just uses the Contentful client from NPM. It sets up its clients and it uses the code that Uniform gave you out of the box, like the Contentful enhancer creator. You give it the client. And you can also have a client list. You can have multiple Contentful clients for different sources in Contentful itself. And what it would then do is actually just query for you. And so for each thing that it downloads, so it gets this guy, it finds the ID, then it queries that for you through this one, and then it returns that here. Right? And so this now has all the information for that hero component, just like normally querying Contentful. And then what we've built is, that's what makes this so powerful. We don't actually want all that data from Contentful because it has all these sys blocks and a whole bunch of other things that we might not be interested in. And so we also have another enhancer that you can put behind it as a chain, which can then look at that model that you gave back and just clean it up a little bit. And so you can chain these enhancers. So you can see that I'm doing the same things for other types of Contentful queries and stuff like that. And so what this means is I can get data from Contentful with, like, let's say there's 20 fields in a certain structure. I can, with the normal enhancer, query that. And then I can chain other enhancers to change it up, right? If I got my rich text from Contentful, what I could do is I get the JSON from the rich text. The enhancer would actually change it into an HTML string. And then I can remove all the sys fields and all the other stuff that I don't need in yet another converter, which is, let's have a look at the Contentful model converter here. This one, for example. This just loops over it, changes some fields, maps it to different data. For example, the image is much simpler now. And so what you can do is you can have a bunch of existing components that have a certain amount of props that they need. But when you just query a new CMS, the props don't align, right? But these enhancers, they can actually align it for you. And so that's how I do it. And so my component itself, when we have a look at my component here, let's say my hero, doesn't actually know a lot about Uniform or Contentful at all. It just needs fields image and just deals with it. So if I now want to change the CMS from Contentful to Prismic or Contentstack or whatever, I just change my enhancer and this component doesn't have to change at all. And so that's how that kind of works and how you can go from a simple just IDs to a much richer thing here. And this you can now give to a page, render components on the fly, look at that type. Let's render a hero component, put the props in, and you're off to the races. And that's how that works. And the interesting bit here is that I chose to make a Tim Benniks compositions project where these enhancers live somewhere else. This means my front end has zero idea of what CMS is or whatever is there. And that helps you a lot with making sure that if I want to change the CMS, you just go to these enhancers, you change it here a little bit, you map the data, and the front end has no idea that something changed and it just works. So this allows you to not really re-platform with like bigger projects anymore, because you have CMSs or commerce tools or things like that. You just change one thing, remove something, add something, you change an enhancer and your front end is the same and everything works. And so this is kind of what I wanted to show you today. And there's lots more we could dive into, but it's probably getting a little long. And so, yeah, that's it. I want to thank you very much for watching and taking the time. And if you like this, feel free to reach out on Twitter at Tim Benniks, or have a look at my YouTube page if that feels like something you might want to do. Lots of content like this there. And you can also go to uniform.dev to find out more about Uniform.
That was a great presentation, Tim. I'm particularly fascinated by this whole concept because I think people, as they build Jamstack apps, they tend to bring in more sources. And sometimes it's a problem that they don't necessarily recognize right away. But then as the application starts to expand, then all of a sudden this whole level of complexity comes into it. And then it's like, well, how do I manage all these different sources and make this easy? So yeah, that was really, really cool. We do have, sorry, go ahead, please.
Oh, no, I just wanted to say thanks because I feel the same. And the interesting bit here is that not every developer has had this problem, but lots of them have. And I've worked at the agency for many, many years doing all these kind of big projects. And we kind of always build Uniform ourselves a little bit. But then it wasn't the time yet to have a startup to actually pull it off. And so I'm pretty happy that it's working out now.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to developers who have this problem, and oftentimes, like I said, it's when you talk to a developer like before they run into this problem, they're like, yeah, I know how to manage sources. Like, it's fine. I'll just do another API call, no big deal. And then
Exactly.
when you talk to the later after they have this, they're like, oh my God, it's such a mess, and I don't know how to clean it up. That whole cable management analogy you use, like it's so hard to clean up after the fact. So yeah, definitely something to, I think most modern developers are, for modern web applications are going to have to deal with at some point as we start to pull in so many different sources for our data. So we did have one audience question, and then I have some other questions, but I also want to just remind folks that you can feel free to throw more questions in. We'll get them answered here with Tim. So feel free to ask your questions right now. But I will ask Sean's question. Does Uniform also write back to the data source? It seems like it'd be confusing to ask a content editor to go to 3 different product data sources to adjust content on a single page.
This is actually a great question. And we have these questions internally as well, like how far do we go? How close do we integrate with these sources? And so we have some proof of concepts where we are trying this out with systems that have APIs that are super rich. Like with Contentful, we could do it. But you might see some issues where data models might change up on the other side. And then how do we know about it? And the more we integrate, the more opinion you introduce and the more complex it gets. And this is also the reason why we don't actually store the data on our platform. Because what if it's sensitive data, or what if something changes on, let's say, the publication of a certain component in a CMS? We don't want to have to deal with all that caching and purging it. And actually, the fact that it's all completely separated allows you to also maybe do it without Jamstack and maybe with SSR, and you put these enhancers I spoke about somewhere else in some serverless function or something else like that. And so we might do it if there's lots of people asking, hey, can you just, I'm always making this hero and I have to do it 5 times a day. Maybe we can figure it out and do it. For now, not.
Okay.
And what we're trying to do is make it as easy as possible to work with, right? So you can click on, let's say that here on, you see the icon for Contentful, and you just click and run. And so you just click in, you go on, and if you then change something and save inside Contentful, we're listening to that connection. So your preview is automatically updated.
Okay, that makes sense, because I would feel like the concern would be if you once you start to bring some of those pieces in, well, you in effect have to rebuild a CMS to live over top of the CMS that you're connecting to.
Exactly. And that's not the point. We're only pointing and composing. We're literally saying these are the things you used, but we don't own any of that data.
Okay. So, but let's say my application, like, I don't know, I'm storing comments, user comments in the scene. Would I have to go around Uniform to be able to write back to it, or I can actually do the post into Uniform and that will be passed along?
Right now you would have to go get alongside of Uniform, because you cannot really post to us unless you want to use the CLI. There's APIs for everything, but it's more of a composition related tool rather than holding data tool. And so it is actually quite an interesting subject to have something with comments. And so what you could see is like Uniform is really great if you have, let's say, a bunch of pages that you have to compose together by hand, right? To really make them like a nice campaign page or a landing page or a home page. But what if you have 100,000 product pages? You don't want to make another composition for every 100,000 pages, right? So we have some sort of tools to have like some dynamic compositions to fill the data later. But you can also just say, okay, I'm going to make Uniform slightly smaller, and I will still connect to my CMS and to my commerce system separately later on, right? That's the whole point of being completely opinionless and agnostic. You can make pages, but you can also make it much smaller and only get one or two components from Uniform, put that on a page that already exists.
Okay. And so when you were talking, I noticed, for instance, you had the logos and stuff inside Uniform. So I was wondering, like, speaking of, it being opinionless, like you don't have to use like a predefined set of data sources. You can define like a custom source of your own. Am I right?
Yes. Yeah, you can.
Okay.
Like, we know that when you're a little bit in that enterprise world and people kind of want to know the usual suspects have to be in there, right? And we integrate with them really, really well. But we are now releasing something called the Mesh Sdk, and Mesh is our name for all these integrations. And that SDK allows you to do it yourself. And so we have Cloudinary in there, for example. And so we have this SDK that came out in our Canary branch. And last week, I just built a Cloudinary integration and use it on my website now. It just happened right after I recorded this talk. But that means if you have some sort of CRM somewhere or some sort of old school thing that might have an API or anything like maybe you want to use Strapi that we don't have an official integration for, you can either make it yourself or you can ask us, hey, do you have something? And then we can give you an example. So yes, you can go crazy if you want.
Okay. And so those enhancers, are they like if I use Contentful, it looked like you were showing, like, is that something that's preset, or you have example code like I can use for Contentful, or do I have to write those every time that I'm using?
Well, there's a bit of a mix going on here. So we have a couple of functions that help you to actually make it something that is an enhancer, to instantiate it. That comes from our NPM packages that are specifically for Contentful. However, you can also just make your own. And on our documentation, you can see we have a whole bunch of like integrate with Contentful or Content Stack or BigCommerce. And there we explain how these enhancers work, which parts you get from NPM from us, and which parts you do yourself. Because, for example, you can connect to multiple different Contentful spaces, because you might have a global space for your legal data and a local space for something else. And we do not tell you how to connect to Contentful. We only tell you what to query. And then we help you to query it. And that's what these enhancers do. So you make two different Contentful clients in your code. And then you just give these clients to a uniform function that will then query for you.
Sure. Okay.
Does that make sense like that?
That makes sense. And I know you didn't really get into it in the presentation, but I know I've looked at Uniform for like that you do things like A/B testing and personalization that
Yes,
you can. So those are like, you get the cable management piece and then you add those pieces on top, and that's kind of
exactly.
like bonus. Okay.
So
Cool.
what the
Excellent.
interesting bit here is that we are dealing with the digital experience platform here in this world. And a digital experience platform is not just your website, your mobile app, and a CMS. There's much more in the context of it to make it great for marketers or end users, for example. And that's where personalization comes in. I think literally every client I've worked for in my career wanted it, but it was too hard to do. And now we have all this new technology, and it's even harder because how can you personalize across a contentful item and then a commerce tools product? Right,
Yeah.
you want that to have to be in one place, and so we add these extra contextual bits around A/B testing and personalization on top of all the stuff I was showing.
Okay, that's cool. Well, I haven't. I mean, I have to definitely check it out again because this is a problem
Sure.
I've seen, like I said, so many times. So it looks like you have a really, really cool solution to it.